Okay, guys, so Super Long D here, back again for another more feedback. And as you probably have been able to guess by now, I don't really keep an itinerary or an agenda of what I'm going to talk about or in what order or how cohesive it is when it comes out of my mouth. So basically, you could call these more of a rambling session than anything. But today, I would like to talk or ramble about the deprecation of sexual education. I know that's kind of a weird thing to branch off into from Resonance of Fate and shit like that. But I had something happen in the past couple of days. It kind of made me think about it, and not think about it in a necessarily negative or positive light, but just come to mind. And what I want to talk about, basically, is why sexual education, and I'm not saying that everyone thinks this, but as a consensus, is sexual education has become taboo. Or not taboo, just it's become something that's had the value stripped from it, and people, whenever a subject of debate comes up about sexual education, let's say in our public school system, there are always those people who they don't place a lot of emphasis on it, and they think it might be in certain ways wrong. They bring up the question of childhood innocence and things like that. They don't want it brought into schools because, everyone has their own religion, and their religions might dictate that they teach their children a different way, or certain things happen at a different time. And that always seems to come up and be a source of, controversy. But I don't want to talk about religion, because that's not what this is about. This is about sexual education in general. And I have noticed that for a lot of people, myself included, technicality is sort of... it makes you feel strange, and I don't know if I'm the only one who feels this way. I mean, let me know if you yourself feel this way. But technicality when it comes to sexuality is it makes me feel strange, almost like I'm, because if it comes to that point where if you're needing to use technical terminology with someone, you almost feel like you feel a little bit wrong, especially because usually when technical terminology is brought into the equation, it's usually coming from someone who is of a position higher than the person they're speaking to. So you're educating someone. So, you're an educator. So you might be teacher, professor, doctor, specialist, anything of, that nature, speaking to someone below you, which is not a bad thing. I'm not trying to, diss on those professions or anything, but I'm saying that for an everyday person like me to be talking to one of my peers and using technical terminology, it feels strange, like I'm maybe, taking advantage of them or encroaching upon their, I don't really know the right words. Maybe you can fill in the blanks for me. I'm having a little bit of trouble with this one, at least getting this thought out. But it feels wrong. And an example I can give is that with a handful of my previous relationships, there have been girls I've been with who really did not know anything. Anything about sex. Sure, they might have watched a porno or things like that, seen that kind of shit, but, shit porno, German Scheiße, that's always the good stuff, anyway, they knew nothing about sex, and a lot of it fell onto me to explain to them. And whenever it did fall onto me like that, I felt really almost dirty. This is probably a better way to explain it. I felt almost dirty because they didn't know, so they were in a state of, ignorance about the subject. And so I felt like I was educating them, which is not a bad thing. Education is a good thing. But like I said, when you're educating a peer who is kind of has that ignorance about things, especially when it comes to sex, it just feels like you're taking advantage of them. I felt like I was taking advantage of them because, stripping them of their innocence, so to speak, which that's not a bad thing either, because that's actually pretty hot in a lot of situations. Of course, I'll probably feel a little ashamed to admit that, but hell, I'm not ashamed to admit anything. I'm just ashamed in the situation. So, in the situation, excuse me, I was taking a drink. I was ashamed, but afterwards, no big deal. But what all this is kind of leading to is the question of technical sexual education in our school systems. And I can't tell you about really what made me think of this, because it's kind of, it's a personal thing. I don't know if they'd want, that broadcast all over the place. But basically, the question that I'm posing is, why would it not be okay, or why should it not be a conventional method to introduce sexual education to the public school systems, and or to any school systems. You're a private institution. Of course, you can pick and choose what you want to do, but public school systems, they're under under government control. So let's keep them in the spotlight here. So why would there be a reason to not introduce that into public school systems? And I'm not talking about high school necessarily. I'm also talking about younger, because the fact of the matter is that there are people out there like me. Yeah, that's right. I said it. There are people out there like me who just fling around the words like cock, balls, pussy, vag grease, shiza, butt sex, faggot. We're in public. We don't make it a big deal to broadcast that, to everyone in a public situation. Pro Gamer and I, when we go out and do shit, we don't make it a point to have other people hear us, because we're assholes, but we're not that big of assholes, and we don't want to, intentionally have anyone hear us, but we generally try to keep it contained. But at the same time, there are people out there like us, and when your kids are out in public, there is a chance that they might pick up on something, and they'll either pick up on something and start using it themselves, look it up on the internet, or ask people at school, or lastly, probably come to you as parents. In a lot of situations, that tends to be the last place a kid goes for information as the parent. Dependent, of course, dependent on the child, dependent on how you've raised them, dependent on the values they have, and things like that. But, if that is the last place they go, or even if it's not, and they approach you with something like that, like, well, what does faggot mean? And you don't necessarily want them to know that. So let's put you in those set of shoes. You don't necessarily want them to know everything there is to know about the terminology of the word faggot and how it's used as a derogatory slang against who, so you don't want them to know about homosexuality, because they don't even know about sexuality yet. So they come to you and they're like, well, what's faggot mean? And you say, well, it's a slang, and it's used to hurt people. And they're going to say, well, what kind of people? I don't understand. I've never heard that before. And this introduces the problem of, I believe there's not enough preemptive education on the subject. So, for an example, you don't start from anywhere other than the bottom. You don't start from anywhere other than the start. If you're learning something, you start from the very beginning. And we can use language as an example. When you're learning a language in a school, in an institution, you learn the proper usage of the language. You don't learn slangs, and you don't learn all the different, all the different little types of dialect and things like that. You just learn what is proper and what is conventional wherever you're learning it. It's proper English, for example. You don't learn everything else that there is to learn about it. You start from the beginning. You start with a base. You don't just jump in. Yeah, of course you could, but it doesn't usually happen that way. For someone who doesn't know English, you could, in theory, put yourself in a situation where you're only learning slang, which I've seen a lot of people do. But let's just use the other example because it makes me sound like less of a dipshit and an asshat. So let's go with that for now. I'm not playing the asshat today, so let's go with the other one. Yeah, so I mean, you start from the beginning. If you're learning anything, you would generally want to start from the beginning. You don't want to start from the middle or, start from all the different tributaries of information that come from that. You want to start with the core. And that's why I wonder what is wrong with sexual education in public school systems, because at the very least, independent from what you would feel comfortable with your children knowing, what your religion might feel comfortable with your children knowing, and when they should come about learning that, if they do at all, at least they're starting at a very basic level. They're learning the very base and technical terminology and responsibility. Very conventional. I mean, this is the same thing that, someone entering a medical profession would learn. This is what they're learning, At the very least, I would say it would be important to give them that.